Arizona Territory, 1876. The relentless summer sun blazed overhead as Brent Dawson wiped sweat from his brow, surveying the parched landscape surrounding his modest ranch. At 25, he had already weathered more hardship than most men twice his age, leaving him with a conviction as unyielding as the desert soil he worked. A man survived the frontier alone or not at all. Partnerships led to betrayal. Friendship invited loss. Love was a luxury that belonged to safer places, gentler times. Not this harsh wilderness where even the land itself seemed determined to break a man. The West demands solitude. Brent often told himself as he worked the cattle, his lean, muscular frame moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His handsome features, square jaw, piercing blue eyes, and sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead might have made him popular in town if he ever bothered to visit. But Brent avoided entanglements of all kinds. The small ranch 10 miles outside of Tucson was all he needed, or so he told himself on the endless nights when silence pressed in from all sides. 2 years earlier, Brent had watched helplessly as Apache raiders had destroyed the neighboring homestead, killing the family he'd grown fond of despite his best intentions to keep his distance. Their deaths had only hardened his resolve. Connection was weakness. Vulnerability was death. The frontier respected only strength and self-reliance. What Brent wanted was simple: to build his small cattle operation into something that would sustain him, unbothered and unattached. What he failed to recognize was the growing emptiness that expanded with each passing season. The conversations he held with his horse for want of human companionship, the way he lingered too long in town when forced to visit for supplies, hungry for voices other than his own. The endless blue sky above seemed to mirror the vast emptiness in his soul, though he'd never admit such poetic nonsense, not even to himself. It was early August when everything changed. Brent had been tracking a stray heifer since dawn when he spotted smoke rising from the edge of his property where it bordered Apache territory. The uneasy peace between settlers and the local tribes had held for nearly 8 months, a record in these parts. But Brent kept his Winchester rifle close as he approached, prepared for trouble. Instead of raiders, he found 2 Apache women collapsed beside a dying campfire. They were extraordinarily tall for Apache women, nearly 6 feet each, and clearly sisters from their similar features. Both were severely dehydrated, their cracked lips and sunken eyes telling Brent they hadn't had water in days. His first instinct was to ride away. Their people weren't his problem. The invisible boundary between his land and theirs was meant to keep them separated, their worlds apart. Getting involved would only lead to complications he couldn't afford. But something, perhaps the last remnant of the boy he'd been before the frontier had hardened him, wouldn't let him turn away. With a muttered curse, Brent dismounted. "You speak English?" he asked gruffly, offering his canteen. The older sister took it with trembling hands and drank deeply before passing it to her sibling. "Yes," she replied in a voice barely above a whisper. "Our horses were stolen. 3 days walking. No water." Brent assessed them critically. They wouldn't survive another day in this heat. "Your people nearby?" The younger sister shook her head weakly. 2 days' journey. Our father's camp." Brent ran a hand through his hair, weighing options that all seemed risky. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he helped them onto his horse. "I'll get you fed and watered at my place. Tomorrow I'll take you home." As he led his horse back toward his cabin, the invisible wall he'd built around himself remained intact, but for the first time in years, a single brick had come loose. At his cabin, Brent watched awkwardly as the sisters devoured the stew he'd prepared and drank pitcher after pitcher of water. They introduced themselves as Tall Willow and Night Sky, daughters of Chief Black Horse. Their gratitude was evident but restrained, their dark eyes studying him with a wariness that mirrored his own. "Why you help?" the elder sister, Tall Willow, asked directly as night fell. "Most white men ride away." Brent busied himself with the fire, uncomfortable with her directness. "Just common decency," he muttered, though the words sounded hollow even to his ears. The truth was more complicated than he cared to admit, that despite his determination to remain alone, something in him rebelled against the isolation he'd imposed upon himself. That night, Brent slept outside, giving the sisters his bed. Under the vast canopy of stars, he wrestled with the unsettling feeling that by this single act of kindness, he had opened a door he wouldn't be able to close. The next morning, Brent set out with the sisters, leading them toward their father's camp. The journey was largely silent, but occasionally one of the women would point out a plant or animal, sharing its Apache name and purpose. Despite himself, Brent found the exchanges oddly comforting after years of solitude. They arrived at the Apache camp by midday. Brent had expected to drop the sisters at the perimeter and depart, but instead found himself surrounded by warriors who escorted him directly to Chief Black Horse himself. The chief was a formidable figure whose face showed the weathering of decades under the Arizona sun. His penetrating gaze assessed Brent thoroughly before he spoke, his English deliberate but clear. "You returned my daughters. You fed them. You brought them home safely." Each statement hung in the air, neither question nor gratitude, but something in between. "Just doing what anyone would," Brent replied uncomfortably, anxious to be on his way. The chief's expression remained inscrutable. "No, not what any white man would do. You have shown honor." He gestured, and a young woman stepped forward from behind him. "This is my youngest daughter, Violet Plumfeather." Brent's breath caught involuntarily. At 20, Violet possessed a striking beauty: high cheekbones, luminous dark eyes, and glossy black hair that fell past her waist. She wore a dress that blended traditional Apache design with elements clearly influenced by settler fashion, its deep blue fabric highlighting her copper skin. "Tomorrow, I bring her to your home," the chief continued matter-of-factly. "She will be your bride." Brent stared in stunned silence, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. That's not necessary. I can't." "It is decided," Black Horse stated with finality. "The Apache do not forget those who show kindness to our people. My daughter will make a good wife." Violet herself had yet to speak, her gaze fixed on the ground, though Brent caught a glimpse of what might have been a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Before Brent could formulate a coherent protest, he found himself being led back to his horse, the chief's words ringing in his ears. "Tomorrow, rancher. We come at midday." The ride back to his cabin passed in a blur of confusion. A wife? The very idea contradicted everything he'd built his life around. Marriage meant vulnerability, dependence, the very entanglements he'd sworn to avoid. And yet, as he prepared for sleep that night, Brent found himself cleaning his modest cabin with unusual care and wondering what color Violet's eyes would look like in proper sunlight. The Apache delegation arrived precisely at midday, just as Black Horse had promised. Brent stood awkwardly on his porch, freshly shaved and wearing his only decent shirt, feeling like a man awaiting his own execution rather than a bridegroom. Chief Black Horse led the procession, followed by the two sisters Brent had rescued, and, finally, Violet herself, riding a painted mare and carrying what appeared to be her personal belongings. She wore a dress of soft buckskin adorned with intricate beadwork, her hair elaborately braided with feathers and small silver ornaments. As promised, Black Horse announced without preamble, "My daughter comes to be your wife." Violet dismounted gracefully and approached, finally meeting Brent's gaze directly. Her eyes were not the dark brown he had expected, but a remarkable amber color that caught the sunlight like polished stone. "I have not agreed to this," Brent said quietly, though his protest lacked conviction. "You need not agree," Black Horse replied simply. "It is a gift you cannot refuse without great insult. But know this, my daughter comes of her own will. She chooses this path." Brent looked at Violet questioningly. She met his gaze without wavering. "I have watched you since you came to this land 2 summers ago," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You work hard. You respect the land. You keep to yourself, but show kindness when truly needed. These are good qualities in a husband." Brent felt something shift inside him, a crack forming in the wall he'd built around his heart. "You've been watching me?" A smile touched her lips. The Apache see much that white men think is hidden. What followed was unlike any wedding Brent could have imagined. There in his dusty yard, with the scent of sage on the wind, Chief Black Horse conducted a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with concessions to Brent's evident discomfort. The sisters, Tall Willow and Night Sky, sang songs in their native tongue, while Violet and Brent exchanged simple vows. Before departing, Black Horse placed a hand on Brent's shoulder. You are family now. The boundary between your land and ours is no more. Remember this when troubles come, as they surely will." With those cryptic words, the chief and the sisters rode away, leaving Brent and Violet alone, husband and wife after a courtship that had lasted less than a day. The awkwardness between them was palpable as evening approached. Brent busied himself with chores while Violet quietly arranged her belongings in the cabin. When night fell, they sat across from each other at his small table, the lamplight casting long shadows. "I don't know how to be a husband," Brent admitted finally, breaking the silence. Violet regarded him thoughtfully. "And I have never been a wife to a white man. Perhaps we will learn together. Why did you agree to this?" Brent asked, the question that had been burning in his mind all day. Violet was quiet for a long moment. "My father believes the future of our people depends on finding peace with yours. This union serves that purpose." She paused, then added more softly, "But I would not have come if I thought you were cruel or weak. I have seen you are neither." That night, Brent slept on the floor, giving Violet his bed. As he lay awake listening to her breathing, he realized with alarming clarity that his carefully constructed solitude had been irrevocably shattered. The question now was whether what replaced it would destroy him or save him. The following weeks unfolded in a strange dance of discovery. Violet proved remarkably adaptable, quickly learning the rhythms of ranch life, while introducing elements of her own culture. She showed Brent how to find water in seemingly barren places, how to use native plants for medicine, how to read the desert in ways his settlers' eyes had never managed. For his part, Brent found himself slowly, cautiously opening doors within himself that had long been sealed shut. He taught Violet to ride Western style and to handle his small herd of cattle. In the evenings, he surprised himself by sharing stories of his childhood back east, tales he hadn't allowed himself to remember in years. Their physical relationship developed with similar caution. What began as accidental touches, hands brushing while passing tools, shoulders meeting as they worked side by side, gradually evolved into deliberate contact. The first time Brent took her hand as they walked back from checking the cattle, Violet's smile lit something within him he'd thought permanently extinguished. Yet for all their growing closeness, Brent maintained one final barrier. He refused to speak of the tragedy that had driven him to isolation, the memories that sometimes woke him in the night, gasping for breath. Whenever Violet's questions veered too close to those wounds, he withdrew, retreating behind the wall that was now crumbling but still stood. 6 weeks after their unconventional wedding, the first real test of their fragile bond arrived in the form of 3 rough-looking riders who appeared at the ranch one afternoon while Brent was mending fences in the far pasture. Violet was alone in the yard when they approached. From their leering expressions and the liquor on their breath, their intentions were immediately clear. The leader, a scarred man with a matted beard, dismounted and approached her with predatory confidence. "Well now, what's a pretty little squaw doing all alone out here?" he drawled, circling her like a wolf. "Didn't know old Dawson was keeping Indian company these days." Violet stood her ground, her hand sliding to the knife she kept at her belt. "My husband will return soon. You should leave." The men laughed. "Husband, is it?" the leader mocked. "Don't reckon that counts for much. Law doesn't recognize marriages with savages." What happened next would later be described with awe in both settler saloons and Apache camps. When the leader reached for her, Violet moved with the deadly precision of someone raised as a chief's daughter. Her knife flashed once, opening a shallow cut across the man's reaching hand. As he howled in pain, she ducked beneath his wild swing and delivered a precise kick that dropped him to his knees. The other 2 men rushed forward only to find themselves facing not just Violet, but tall Willow and Night Sky, who seemed to materialize from the surrounding brush like spirits, each armed with bows drawn and arrows notched. The confrontation froze in tableau until the pounding of approaching hoofbeats announced Brent's arrival. He took in the scene at a glance, his wife standing tall over a kneeling, bleeding man, the sisters with arrows aimed at the other 2 riders. "What's happening here?" he demanded, dismounting with rifle in hand. "Just a misunderstanding," the leader said quickly, rising to his feet and backing away. "Didn't know the squaw was spoken for." Brent's finger tightened on the trigger. "That's my wife you're talking about. And you're trespassing on my land." The tension stretched taut until the leader finally nodded to his companions. "We're riding out. No harm done." As they mounted and prepared to leave, the leader turned back with a malevolent grin. Might want to watch your back, Dawson. Folks around here don't take kindly to men who go native, especially men with your history. The cryptic threat hung in the air as they rode away. When they were gone, Brent turned questioningly to the Apache sisters. We watch over our sister, Tall Willow explained simply. Father's orders. That night, after the sisters had departed for their own camp nearby, Violet confronted Brent as they prepared for sleep. What did he mean about your history? What are you hiding from me? Brent stared into the fire, his face a mask of old pain. For a long moment, Violet thought he would retreat again behind his wall of silence. But something had changed between them. Before I came here, he began slowly, I worked as a deputy marshal in Kansas. There was a wanted man, a killer who'd murdered 3 families. I tracked him for months and finally cornered him. Brent's voice grew hollow. He had a wife, children. They were hostages to his violence as much as anyone. I tried to get them away safely, but... His voice broke, and Violet moved to sit beside him, her hand covering his. He used them as shields. When the shooting was over, they were all dead. Him, his wife, their 2 little girls. The newspapers called me a hero for stopping him, but the families of his wife and children called me a murderer. The words came faster now, a poison finally being drawn from a festering wound. There was an investigation. I was cleared of wrongdoing, but I couldn't live with those ghosts. So I came here, as far from people as I could get. Violet was silent for a long moment, absorbing his confession. And this is why you push everyone away? Why you tried to live alone? Brent nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I destroy what I touch. I'm not fit for family or love. Look at me, Violet commanded, and when he finally raised his gaze to hers, she placed a hand on each side of his face. You are not that man anymore. The past is a shadow, but we do not live in shadows. We live in today's light. That night, for the first time, they truly became husband and wife, finding in each other's arms a healing that neither had expected to discover on the harsh frontier. As they lay together afterward, Brent realized with startling clarity that the wall around his heart had finally collapsed completely. But the threat from the 3 riders was not idle. Word spread through nearby settlements about Dawson's squaw, and the uneasy peace between settlers and Apache was further strained by their union. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Brent awoke to find his fence cut and half his cattle missing. The tracks led toward Apache territory, too obviously, Brent thought, as if someone wanted to ignite conflict. Violet agreed. This is not our people's way, she said firmly as they followed the trail. To steal a few cattle in secret, perhaps, but not to leave such clear signs. They tracked the missing cattle to a narrow canyon where 3 men, the same ones who had confronted Violet, were making camp. The stolen cattle were pinned in a hasty corral of brush and rope. They want you to blame the Apache, Violet whispered as they observed from a ridge above. To destroy what we are building. Brent nodded grimly. And they'll likely report Indian cattle thieves to the army, bringing soldiers down on your people. The old Brent would have confronted the thieves directly, rifle in hand, confident in his speed and aim. But marriage to Violet had taught him there were other approaches. Together, they formulated a plan. As night fell, Violet slipped into the rustlers' camp like a shadow, using skills learned since childhood. While the men slept, she removed the firing pins from their rifles and loosened their saddle cinches. Meanwhile, Brent worked to quietly dismantle their makeshift corral. At dawn, they executed their trap. Brent fired a single shot into the air, startling both the cattle and the rustlers' horses. As the cattle stampeded through the weakened corral, Violet let out an Apache war cry that echoed off the canyon walls, making it sound as if a dozen warriors were descending. The panicked thieves grabbed their sabotaged rifles and leapt for their horses, only to find themselves thrown as the loosened saddles slipped. By the time they recovered, Brent and Violet had rounded up the scattered cattle and held them at rifle point. You have a choice, Brent called out. Leave this territory and never return, or face charges for cattle rustling. You can't prove anything, the leader snarled, though his bravado was undercut by his obvious fear of the Apache woman at Brent's side. The army might not believe an Apache, Brent agreed, but they'll believe a former deputy marshal with a stolen cattle brand on his hip. Your choice. Faced with the prospect of a hanging offense, the rustlers chose to flee, leaving their supplies behind. As Brent and Violet watched them go, she slipped her hand into his. "We are stronger together than apart," she observed quietly. "Perhaps this is what my father saw." The incident marked a turning point in their relationship and in Brent's standing with the Apache. Word of how Violet and Brent had outsmarted the cattle thieves spread through both communities. Rather than driving them apart, the threat had cemented their unusual union. As summer turned to fall, Brent found himself drawn increasingly into the life of Violet's people. He attended tribal councils with her, learned their language, and slowly earned, if not friendship, then at least respect from many who had initially viewed him with suspicion. For her part, Violet expanded her influence on the ranch, introducing sustainable practices from her people's traditions and establishing a garden that combined European vegetables with native plants. The cabin transformed under her care, becoming a true home rather than merely shelter. Their growing contentment was shattered one crisp October morning when a military detachment arrived at the ranch. The captain, a thin-faced man named Hollister, dismounted stiffly and approached Brent with poorly concealed disdain. "Brent Dawson?" he inquired, though it was clearly a formality. "I have orders to establish a new army post nearby. This land has been designated as suitable." Brent felt Violet tense beside him. "This is private property, Captain, legally purchased and paid for." Hollister's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. However, the government has the right to appropriate land for military purposes with fair compensation, of course." He cast a meaningful glance at Violet. "Though I'm given to understand your domestic arrangements might complicate your legal standing." The implication was clear. Brent's marriage to an Apache woman made him vulnerable to losing his property rights in the eyes of territorial authorities. "You have 3 days to consider the Army's generous offer," Hollister continued, handing Brent an envelope. "After that, we will begin construction regardless. I suggest you comply willingly." After the soldiers departed, Brent opened the envelope to find an offer of compensation far below the ranch's value. The true purpose was transparent: force him off the land, disrupt his marriage to Violet, and establish a military presence to control the Apache. "They will not stop with your land," Violet said quietly as they considered their options that evening. "This post will be used to push my people further into the mountains, away from our traditional hunting grounds." Brent knew she was right. The pattern had played out across the West. Treaties made and broken, tribes confined to ever smaller territories until they were effectively prisoners. His ranch stood at a strategic location between settler communities and Apache lands. Controlling it meant controlling movement throughout the region. "We have to fight this," he said finally. "Not with rifles. We'd never win that battle. But with the white man's own weapons, law and politics." What followed was a desperate race against time. While Violet rode to inform her father of the threat, Brent traveled to Tucson to seek legal counsel. There he discovered that Captain Hollister's orders were questionable at best. The territorial governor had authorized surveys for a potential post, but no final approval for construction had been granted. Armed with this information, Brent sent telegrams to newspapers in Tucson, Phoenix, and even as far as Denver, alerting them to a potential military overreach. He located a sympathetic lawyer who agreed to file an emergency injunction against the Army's actions. Meanwhile, Chief Blackhorse mobilized his own response. Rather than preparing for battle, he sent runners to neighboring Apache bands and even to peaceful Navajo communities to the north, assembling a coalition of tribal leaders who had standing agreements with the territorial government. The day before Hollister's deadline, Brent returned to the ranch to find an extraordinary gathering taking place. Chief Blackhorse had established a camp on the property, but not as Brent had feared, with warriors prepared for conflict. Instead, he had brought tribal elders, women, and children, along with 3 territorial officials who had negotiated previous agreements with the Apache. "What is this?" Brent asked Violet in amazement. She smiled, a mixture of pride and determination in her expression. "My father says if they want to build a fort here, they must first remove peaceful families under the watchful eyes of government witnesses and newspaper men." She pointed to where 2 journalists were already taking notes and sketching the scene. "The Army can fight warriors," Violet continued, "but they cannot be seen driving women and children from their homes. Not after the controversies of Sand Creek and the Washita. The Eastern newspapers would crucify them. Brent shook his head in admiration. Your father is a skilled strategist. As is his daughter, Black Horse said, approaching them with unexpected warmth in his expression. And his son-in-law, it seems. Your legal maneuvers have created quite a stir in Tucson. When Captain Hollister arrived the following day with his men, he found not an isolated rancher he could intimidate, but a property filled with peaceful Apache families, territorial officials documenting the proceedings, and journalists eager for a story about military heavy-handedness. Furthermore, Brent presented him with a court injunction prohibiting any construction pending a full review of the appropriation order, along with evidence that the captain had overstepped his authority. Faced with a potential scandal and legal complications, Hollister was forced to withdraw, promising a return that both Brent and Black Horse suspected would never materialize. The army would find less politically complicated land elsewhere. As the impromptu gathering dispersed over the following days, Brent found himself accepting handshakes and thanks from people who months earlier would have viewed him with suspicion or hostility. The boundary between worlds that he had once thought impermeable had revealed itself to be surprisingly fluid. What happens now? He asked Violet as they stood together watching the last of her people's lodges being dismantled. Now we build, she replied simply. Not just a ranch, but a bridge. In the year that followed, the Dawson Ranch became something neither Brent nor Violet could have imagined when they first met. Under their combined care, the cattle operation thrived, but more significantly, the ranch became a place where Apache and settler could meet on neutral ground. Violet established a trading post where Apache crafts could be fairly exchanged for manufactured goods, circumventing the exploitation common at reservation trading posts. Brent used his growing influence with territorial officials to advocate for enforcement of treaty rights, earning him enemies among some settlers, but powerful allies among those who recognized that peace benefited everyone. When Violet announced her pregnancy the following spring, the celebration involved both communities. The old medicine woman from her tribe blessed the unborn child, while the circuit-riding preacher who occasionally visited nearby ranches offered prayers of his own. I never thought I would have this, Brent confessed to Violet as they sat together on their porch one evening, her hand guiding his to feel the baby's movements. Family, purpose, peace. Violet leaned against him, her presence as essential to him now as air. You were hiding from life, she said softly. As was I, in my own way. My father saw what neither of us could, that together we might build something neither could create alone. A wise man, your father, Brent acknowledged. Though I still wonder if he knew what would happen when he offered me a bride I couldn't refuse. Violet's laugh was warm in the gathering dusk. He says it was the ancestors who guided his decision. I think perhaps he simply saw a good man who needed to remember how to live. Their son was born as summer ripened across the land. A child of two worlds who would know neither the isolation that had nearly consumed his father nor the threatened traditions of his mother, but rather a new way forward that honored both. They named him Thomas, after Brent's father, with the Apache name Rising Sun, for he had been born at dawn. Black Horse pronounced him the future of both peoples, a declaration that might have seemed grandiose had the old chief not spoken with such conviction. Standing outside their cabin with his wife and child as the evening star appeared above the western mountains, Brent Dawson finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier's harshness was real, but it was not the whole story. The West was also a place of beginning, of unlikely connections, of new families forged across the boundaries others thought impermeable. His life had been transformed not by surrendering to vulnerability, as he had feared, but by discovering that true strength came from connection rather than isolation. In Violet's love, in their child's future, in the community they were building between worlds, Brent had found not weakness but a resilience he could never have achieved alone. As if reading his thoughts, Violet touched his cheek gently. The ancestors say a man standing alone is like a single arrow, easily broken. But a man surrounded by family and community is like a bundle of arrows, unbreakable. Brent looked at the remarkable woman who had become his wife, at the child they had created together, at the ranch that had transformed from a hideout to a home. I'm beginning to think your ancestors were right, he said with a smile, and pulled her close as the last light faded from the western sky. leaving them beneath the vast canopy of stars that watched over all the peoples of the frontier, each finding their way home in the darkness.